Well, welcome to those of you who have been following this series, and for those of you who are maybe new to this series. I want to speak today about Beaubear's Island, but without reference to anything that's growing on it. I want to talk about the geological foundation that comprises the island itself. If you look at a map of New Brunswick, the most northeast point from here is Miscou Island. If you follow that southwest, you go to Grand Lake. And then if you go due east, you go to Cape Tormentine. You have just covered an area known as the Eastern Lowlands. And the underlying bedrock there is sandstone. 300 million year old, give or take a day, sandstone. That is the basement of the island itself. It is clearly exposed on the northwest shoreline, west end of the island. And at least for me, it's fascinating to look and to touch sand deposited by water, wind, or both, long before the dinosaurs ever walked the earth. I just find that amazing. Now just east, you're coming east on the island, now just east of these cliffs, there's a clay formation that can be seen literally at various points, both on the island and even the surrounding areas on both sides of the island. It's a gray color and very clean. Once you get past the surface part of it and get into it's beautiful clay. It was formed about 4,000 years ago as the glaciers were melting, and this whole area, as sea levels rose, was simply inundated by water, and this settled. As you go further east, you run into two layers of very dark brown sand. One very distinguished from one another. One has pebbles in it, fairly large pebbles, about so big. And the other one is reasonably clear. However, these are almost rock hard. They look like sand, they're composed of sand, but they're not lithified in the sense of becoming rock. But they're hard, they're rock hard. And they're referred to as hardpan, Ferricrete, duracrust. They're hard though. You can hit it with a stick and it takes quite a bit to actually take some off. Here's where it affects what grows on the island, especially those old growth white pines. The roots of any plant need water, oxygen, and relatively low compaction in the soil. In a sense, water has to travel through it, even oxygen has to travel through it, and of course, roots have to travel with it. The young pines on the island, like all the other plants, grow, keep in mind, young pines grow roots within the top 30 centimeters of the soil. And there's a ratio that I found out that for every 2.5 centimeters in depth, 1 inch, the roots will spread out 1 meter, just over a yard. So that far down, that far out. And it's the surface extension between the root radius itself and the tree diameter. With young pines especially, the tree diameter has to be less than 20 centimeters, which is about 8 inches. You're talking about a tree like that. Now, hardpan is composed of colloidal clay, carbonates, and iron oxides. That's why it's that dark chocolate color, and of course, why it's hard. Water can soften it. We have found that out. But drought hardens it. And when you look back, that's sometime in history, even though it was inundated with marine waters, flooded. At one point, this had to be a very dry area, in a sense, drought-stricken, to harden this up before anything was growing on it. And that sandy slush that was flowing from the north as the glaciers melted and ended, and must have gotten dry enough to form the hardpan. Now, you add to that an acidic soil with low pH value, and you have a soil that white pines take to. But with the hardpan lurking just below the surface, 1 meter below the surface, the taproot, that main root that comes down right from the trunk, which is the primary root, it meets a dead end. And the lateral roots, which spread out, that's the secondary system, they're spreading out in search of survival. They have to find the water. They have to find the minerals. They have to find the room to make it. And that hardpan sits there like the bottom of a swimming pool, you know, daring the roots to break it. Now, a small white pine, such like that, could send roots down 1 meter without a problem. And they can spread out 5 meters without much of a problem. But then they keep growing. That's the problem. It's the old growth pines who need roots 10 meters in depth. We're getting 30 feet down. They need to get almost into the island just to absorb the river as it goes past and kind of goes into that rock down there. And some have to go down even more than that. They need a lot of water to survive. I was reading, in a sense, the plumbing system in a tree. These white pines, I mean, some of them are like this. They're huge. And I just found out in a report from the government that these trees were looked at a couple decades ago and estimated to be seedlings, say this big, 1-year-old seedling, somewhere back about 1750s to the 1760s. So they're quite old. I mean, they were seedlings when the Acadians were here fleeing from the British during that great deportation thing that was going on. These are witnesses to history. Now, the thing is, thanks to those melting glaciers, we have a lot of sandy soil on the island. But when you add that hardpan barrier, and we wind up with a stabilization problem, when those pines get old, like some of them are old, and we get a hard wind from a hurricane or a nor'easter, it's kind of, and that becomes the final episode of that tree, and we have downed trees over there. But what is fascinating, given that environment and that rock foundation, is how long these trees have actually lasted. You know, some of them are, 250 plus years old. That's pretty good for a tree. But when they do come down, and that great crown that was up there makes a hole in the sky, the sun comes down, the canopy opens, and new growth takes place. That's the cycle as it restarts again and continues decade after century. I love the island. I'm fascinated every time I go on it. All I can say is if these little lectures here are interesting, and depending on what happens with COVID and stuff like that, I ask you to come and join me sometime. Take a tour. Look at these things that I'm talking about. Feel what I'm talking about. And if you like this series, support it, sponsor it. Until next time, take care.